think we're live now.
Good.
So, kia ora koutou. Just do my introductions to welcome to the session. This is a joint meeting between the Interest Group for International Indigenous Data Sovereignty and the Working Group for the Fair Data Maturity Model. And this session is around implementing the CARE principles. Before we do some introductions to the rest of the panelists or the speakers for this session, just want to remind people that this is being recorded. If you can keep your mic off when you're not speaking, feel free to add your names into the chat on the side. Feel free to add questions for the speakers to the chat on the side. We do have a collaborative notes document. If there are thoughts that people have about different sorts of criteria or indicators and they're things which we might want to work on in the future, please add them to that document. When we have breakout sessions at the back end of the session, there'll also be the chance to add thoughts there as well. My name is Maori Hudson. I'm a member of the Whakatōhea Nation. I'm based in New Zealand. I'm an associate professor at the University of Waikato and a member of Te Mana Raronga, the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, and also a member of the Global Indigenous Data Alliance, and have been a part of the interest group since around 2018. So I will just pass over to Edith to introduce herself.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the session. I am Edith Herzog from Europe, living in Brussels, originally Hungarian, and I am a member of the Fair Data Maturity Working Group, one of the co-chair, with Shelley and Keith. Plus I'm in the RDA Council. So welcome to all, and I hope that the session will be successful. Thank you. Shelley.
Hello, I am Shelley Stahl with the American Geophysical Union. I am our Senior Director for Data Leadership and delighted to be a co-chair here with Edith and Keith, and I'm based out of the United States.
And I'm Keith Russell. I live and work on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So that is Australia, Melbourne. I work for the Australian Research Data Commons, and so welcome everybody.
And thanks for that. So the first part of the session will involve some presentations, and I'm going to hand over to Edith to start us off.
Yeah, so what I want to say that today I'm not talking about the CARE and FAIR data. I will strictly speak about the process, that how the CARE criteria process can benefit from the FAIR data maturity criteria processes. So maybe to explain that the goal is the efficiency gain, you can see that we started the FAIR abbreviation in 2012, and we ended the FAIR data maturity model 8 years later when we launched the FAIR data maturity model criteria. So now with the CARE, we started only 2 years ago when the CARE abbreviation has been agreed in Botswana. Therefore, the big question that can we accelerate the process and get to the CARE criteria for some of the elements of the principle, instead of 8 years, maybe 4 years, 5 years, or 6 years. So the question is really about the gaining efficiency and learning from the process, as we did for the data maturity criteria. And I think that, of course, it will go hand in hand with the FAIR data standards to apply for the CARE data, but this is something different this time. So what are the next steps? And I talked a lot what could be the next steps. I think that one is a very important element to increase the awareness of the CARE principle in general for other communities, to make sure that the CARE principles are entering to the entire data RDA community, to all different working groups. And I think that Shelley will speak about that, how difficult it is to get the CARE principles in the practice, in the real use. But for me, very important element, which is a learning point from the FAIR data maturity model, that we have to first and most select the principles that are either policy driven or require technical solutions. I remember that how many debates we had within FAIR, while we decided that FAIR is not equal to open, and open can be solved by the open science policies, while the FAIR solutions are offering technical solutions. And therefore, I think that this is the major lesson I'd like to show today, that how we can find those elements within the care principle which require technical solutions and can be fixed with it. And define maybe the policy word, which can be open, but can be maybe something else, which requires policy solutions in the future. So again, the timeline I'd like to show that if we decide to go to that way with care, then it's a very heavy work. We had 10 working webinars, 3 plenaries, different surveys, different testing, different feedbacks, many discussions. We had always two of the same session to make sure that all the community is engaged. So if you decide to go to that route with the care principle, then you have to prepare for this kind of workload in the next coming months, years, etc. So that was the FAIR data maturity workflow. And, some of you went through, so it was, we defined the objectives, we went through the development for each single criteria, we did the testing, and finally we arrived to the recommendations. So can we do the same process for the care? And in my opinion, it will not be so straightforward until we decide a very zero point, which is the care principles adopted in the working group. I think that it's done. The care principles endorsed by the RDA, promoting it through the organization and through the outstanding work. Then we have to go through the selection process, and then we have the technical solutions, the part of the elements which require technical solutions, and the other part which require policy solutions, and then you can apply everything you could do for the FAIR data maturity model. And we are in that very moment that can we divide the technical from the policy solutions. I think that would be my suggestion for the working group. And I will stop here because, we prepared the Menti, but we decided to go another route recently. So I will stop here and I give the floor to Shelley. Thank you very much for your attention. And I try to get out.
Thank you, Edith. And I'm going to try to share. So let's see if I can do that. Could someone just see some sort of slide? And I can't see the little emojis. If you could just say it out loud, that'd be great.
Yep, yeah, we're now on your slide in presentation mode. It looks beautiful.
All right, wonderful. So of the many things that I do, I really enjoy working with this particular cluster at the Earth Science Information Partners. So primarily US based, but also having growing groups in Australia, in the UK. ESIP has been is a really incredible environment, and I'll talk a little bit about it. This is Margaret O'Brien's talk that she gave earlier this week in a session with Maori and Stephanie. And so if you went to that talk, don't worry, it won't be the same talk. Margaret's background is very different than mine, so I will give you my version of the talk, so you're not wasting your time. So ESIP, we talk about ESIP being the table. Like when you're trying to solve a problem, what is it that ESIP provides to the community, bringing together different domains and industry and academia, and we say, well, ESIP is the table. They provide the space, the safe space for those of us working on these challenges to actually solve them, and they. If you have any interest in participating, you would be more than welcome. The sponsors for ESIP are NASA and NOAA and USGS within the United States, and I think I can move on. And here's a little bit more about the types of different sorts of partnerships. The repository community is, some examples are over there on the left-hand side. Margaret is with the Environmental Data Initiative, so the EDI logo is hers. The second grouping there has the AGU local, that's my organization, where different sorts of institutions in academia, and then heading to the right, you have the sponsors themselves, and then different service organizations that pull together other efforts there on the far right. So there's a link at the bottom you can take a look at. So the Sustainable Data Management Cluster has had a previous activity, and as we were finishing that one up and asking ourselves, well, should we dissolve, which is, if you finish your task, that here in RDA, you have a particular recommendation, and then you can stand down or go into maintenance mode. We were having this discussion about, we're talking about repository activity. So this is very repository oriented. As a repository, how do I provide the best possible service to the community that I'm holding their data for? And we were discussing the different frameworks that exist. Trust was fairly recent as it came out specifically for repositories. And Wim Hugo had just done a talk with the World Data System, bringing together the trust, fair, and care. And I had grabbed a screenshot from his talk and showed it to this group, and they said, you know what? Yes, let's do all three, and let's include care, and we'll learn more about it, and that will be a great opportunity. And the goal is that we would take a look at these three frameworks from the point of view of a repository, and if we were to fully develop a roadmap, not fully implement, but fully develop a roadmap, what would benefit my community, what would benefit the repositories community the most? What would you do first, and what would you do second? And then how would that align with these different frameworks, so you could see what your goals would be as you move forward? So we're still working on that particular document. So we decided to start with care because we didn't know care very well at all. And thought, all right, we'll do a deep dive. And I just love this picture that Margaret picked out, because it really demonstrates that with teamwork, and you can apply this in multiple ways. I know care evolved, but having different voices at the table, thinking about how to implement as a repository, and be able to represent those principles well, felt like we all needed each other at the table, because not any of us understood the principles separately. Of course, except the folks that wrote them, so I'll give them that credit. So we haven't really walked through those principles just yet, but if you're here in this session, I assume that you have some understanding, and if not, maybe I'll just take a second. So here are the three letters. Care includes collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, and ethics. And so as we walked through each of these elements, we said, okay, what would be the role of the repository to implement this element? So we had a very specific focus, and we were able to set certain things aside. But what I think many of you, as you're part of RDA, you understand that the repository has a pivotal role. It enables capability. It enables fair. It's the heart of trust. And to implement care well, we really needed to think through what that meant to that particular community and representing it. So it was a really exciting and fascinating conversation. So as a data repository, you publish and you archive data from research projects, right? So that makes sense. So it's trying to orient you to the kinds of things we were thinking. You make that data available for use in the future, and you curate it to a level that's appropriate for your repository. And we all know there are different types of repositories. And easy discovery. Okay, so just generally laying it out there. And then each repository can provide their own services as to how they'll do that for their community, what that curation looks like, what archiving looks like. And there are a number of different frameworks and tools and certifications out there that have guidance in order to make that happen by discipline and sometimes more broadly. I think that's a picture of EDI's team there at the bottom, by the way. Again, if you heard Margaret's talk, this one's a completely different talk. All right, so the repository, that pivotal role of the repository, you have got researchers that are looking for data. The repository is in the middle of it. You have folks that want to reuse some of the research, and you know, in our case, we're looking at the Earth and space sciences. So these are all the Earth phenomena and those of other planets. And let's keep going. So here are the three frameworks we were looking at. We were very familiar with FAIR. We have representatives on our team that know trust very well, and so data-oriented, repository-oriented, and because of the work that we've done, that Edith just presented, as we were analyzing the process and talking with Stephanie and talking with Maui and their other colleagues. It really is the people side of data, and this is what I brought to the table as I was trying to support this effort. FAIR being machine readable and CARE being, well, what are the people elements here, and how do we represent the interests of the people, and in this case, Indigenous sovereignty. So about 10 hours over multiple months, we had some just patient team members from the CARE team, Maui being one of those. And we are so grateful for the time they spent with us. And then the cluster members are below. Let's see. So I'm going to provide you with the draft information that we have. And we are cautious to say this is incredibly early draft. If anyone wants to participate in this effort, you're welcome to develop it further. So as we went through each category, we mapped it into repository concepts. So repositories align to their community. They provide services to their community. So knowing that community, that science, that discipline, and who that community serves is important. And then protocols for the repository, so technical end. Edith talks about policy and technology. So this one is definitely hitting technology. Communication and outreach, responsibilities of making sure that there's alignment with the community that you are serving, and then additional to technical aspects. And then we had some mixed bag. So you can see early draft. Alrighty, so knowing your community. In order to care for Indigenous data, you have to be fully engaged with your Indigenous community. There is approval processes and protocols that they're going to want to engage with, and you really need that relationship. So I'm not going to read all of these, but Maui, I'm not sure if this particular link is within our notes, but as soon as I finish sharing, I'll go ahead and put the link to these slides. And you can take your time and walk through them. There's some notes within the section below. And more than happy to have discussion and consider other aspects of these elements. Again, this was early draft. So repository protocols having to do with, here we have policies noted and different protocols and restrictions that are possible. And different way, communication and outreach was really critical. Being able to keep in contact with the community and make sure you're always meeting the needs of your community. So when I say that, I think you might be able to also hear that it's possible other communities could benefit from this type of implementation. So there's not only the Indigenous peoples, but you could probably imagine other communities, should they be interested in moving forward with something like this. Technical and this is the mixed bag. So I will let you all look at that. So we're continuing to work on this, and thank you. I will now try to stop sharing. Any day now, I will try. Oh, here we go.
Kia ora, Shelley, that was great. And so I guess one of the things I just wanted to mention before we continue with sort of the slides I'm going to share is how useful it's been to have essentially a group of practitioners just make the effort to think about how care might apply in their context. And so I think, particularly from the interest group for the International Indigenous Data Sovereignty working group, we're really happy that people are making that effort and they are thinking about how it might apply in their context. And so, as Edith was talking about the way in which there was the sort of different ways that FAIR started to be developed and applied as it emerged, I think we're still in that same sort of exploratory space. And so I think it's really nice to see the efforts that the ESIP team have done to develop their thinking in this area. So I'm going to just share some slides here myself. I can make this work too. Okay. All right. So I'm guessing this is all good?
Yeah, we see it.
Great, thank you. So I'm providing this presentation on behalf of myself and Stephanie Carroll as the co-chairs of the Indigenous Data Sovereignty interest group. And it's the sorts of efforts or the efforts that have been made to start trying to think about how criteria can be developed in part from our perspectives as members of different Indigenous data sovereignty networks. And so Shelley did a great job of sort of laying out the care principles, and Edith mentioned that they emerged from a workshop at RDA P12 in Botswana in 2018. So it's been generated from this community and started to develop from here. Here is the paper that was just released last year, which described the care principles for Indigenous data governance. And I thought it was just useful to highlight how the work within the special interest group is also translating into the published environment. And also, really wanting to reinforce the point that was being made that as the care principles were being developed, that they'd been looked at alongside the FAIR principles and others, and that assessment which Shelley spoke about with the FAIR principles being very kind of data-centric, and that the care principles became people and purpose-centric, and that's why we saw that they would be able to work in a very complementary fashion to each other. And so that's what's led to the activities of all these joint committee activities between the Indigenous Data Sovereignty Interest Group and the FAIR Data Maturity Model Interest Group. And that has also led to this publication, which has just come out, authored by the people involved in this panel today, just really starting with our initial thoughts around what operationalizing the care and FAIR principles looks like for Indigenous data futures. So I encourage you to go and have a look at that article as well. And I think there's, a really interesting point which Edith's made about thinking about how the principles themselves might be operationalized, and that some of them will be best done in a policy environment and some of them will have a technical solution. This is sort of an extract from the IATSIS Code of Ethics. So Keith will be familiar with this, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. They have an area in Indigenous leadership around Indigenous knowledge and data. And if you scroll down to the bottom of this section of text, there's the point that institutions with responsibilities for data access and use policies or design and management of data ecosystems should adopt Indigenous data sovereignty and governance principles. And the second point there, B, researchers must be aware of and apply international data principles of fair and care. And so this translation, or the sort of advocacy for these frameworks to be used, is started to enter a policy environment. The other example, which I just wanted to highlight, has been some work that's been done by this project out of the EU called OpenTEK, or Open Traditional Ecological Knowledge. And this is an open data platform for storing data about, or information about, local indicators of climate change impacts. And the people involved with this who spoke at a session, I think of the session alongside the Shelley earlier, had really taken on board the notion that they need to be responsible in the way that they're thinking about their data use and data access policies, and have looked at care and really thought quite deeply about how they might be implemented. And so one of the things which they did was to do a care self-assessment, in a very similar way to Shelley was talking with the ESIP community, and just essentially looking at the care principles and the sub-principles and thinking about them in the context of the activities they were doing and how they might be able to react to it. So you can find this statement about their self-assessment and what was done on their website. And they also made a further commitment and have a data sovereignty statement on their website as well. And so as Shelley was talking about the different ways in which they've thought about actions that are relevant to their community, and then how those actions might relate to particular principles or sub-principles within the care framework, we really have come to realize that this is unlikely to be a one-to-one relationship, and it's more likely to be a many-to-many relationship. And that's reflected in this diagram here, where you'll have a particular activity or a particular process which is likely to contribute to aspects or criteria that could sit under multiple principles. And so in terms of the thinking that we've been doing about how criteria might be constructed for each of these principles, we think that there's definitely going to be some technical solutions, and actually some of the principle or some of the criteria that might relate to the FAIR principles might also contribute to expressions of care. And so what I'm showing here is essentially a sort of a table which we've started putting together, which outlines on the left-hand side the principle. And so, this is obviously the one for collective benefit, which has been broken up into not only just its sub-principles, but sort of each of the elements of the sub-principle. And so you see how this collective benefit for inclusive development and innovation has a component that relates to, how do you establish a foundation for Indigenous innovation and value generation, and another one around promoting local self-determined development processes. And so for each of the principles, we've tried to think about what is the element that's been reflected in it, which we might like to create an indicator for. And so then as we move across to the right, you see OpenTEK, the example which I shared a little bit earlier, and the sorts of things which they had talked about in the context of their self-assessment. Don't look at the spelling. The spelling in some of these places isn't great. Alongside that, Te Mana Raronga, that's the Māori Data Sovereignty Network, and they have a set of Māori Data Sovereignty principles. And we wanted to look at the things that had been articulated in that space and see where they might sit, or how they might align themselves with each of these different components of the care principles and the sub-principles. Similarly, the Indigenous Collaboratory, That's a research group which Stephanie Carroll leads, and a group of academics which gets together to discuss issues around Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous data governance. And they've started thinking too about what sorts of actions might align themselves to those different components of the principles. And then Tikanga Paihere is a data access protocol that's grounded in Indigenous values. And so that's something that's operational within the context of Statistics New Zealand, our sort of National Statistics Office. And it's used as a data access protocol to inform access to an integrated data infrastructure. And so, you know, in that same way, there's a whole series of questions and components which that protocol talks about, and we wanted to do the same thing with aligning to these principles as well. And so for each of the principles, and as we move from collective benefit to authority to control, the same process sits in place in relation to the table. A recognition of the principle itself, the sub-principle, and then that sub-principle being broken up into its component parts. And you see, you know, that at the moment, you know, I really could only fit in sort of on the screen these four entities, but you know, when we're in the position to add the kinds of criteria that ESIP have put together, and some other activities which we know are going on, or sort of places where people are thinking about the implementation of care, and we start to add those criteria to the list, we can get a picture of where things might sit and which of the criteria being imagined fit best for this process going forward. And so similarly, as we work across the area of responsibility, I think we started to get a little bit more sparse. You know, this process is only just starting and getting underway. And so, you know, I think this will evolve and develop. But we're also hoping that in the context of this workshop that people will be able to look at these sort of ideas and see how the sorts of, you know, things that you know from your experience, from your context, might best sit as an indicator or a proxy for the element that's reflected under the principles. And lastly, for ethics, have a same thing here in place. So and so this is all I wanted to share at the moment. If I stop sharing here and then get back onto get back here, that's really where we've been able to get to so far. And so each of the slides that show the tables and how some thinking is emerging for each of the principles and the sub-principles are now or have been added to the Google Doc. And we're really, inviting people to contribute their thoughts and add their ideas to that as well. So maybe before we think about moving into breakout rooms, are there any questions that people have for any of the speakers or the presentation so far?
There's a really interesting conversation happening in chat having to do with thinking about care at the time of the data management plan and how to guide researchers to select repositories that can support the principles. That means a lot of infrastructure and definition has to get into place, which isn't there yet. But I'm wondering if somebody from that community wants to share the text. Joy, I'm thinking of you if you don't mind coming off mute. Sorry, if you don't want to be put on the spot, that's okay. But I think Joy is associated with DMP Online and can see what all of the different connections are that need to be included there. So so part of the life cycle of a researcher. Yep.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we'd been talking about in the context of care as well is that it, as a, I guess, a set of principles, they apply right across a sort of a data life cycle. And so how they, the sorts of things which you might look for at the kind of the point of data generation probably look quite different from what it looks like in the context of a repository or what it looks like in terms of some sort of data use later on. And so I think that's sort of another component which I think we'll have to give thought to. It may emerge from the engagement with different RDA communities over time.
Joy, I think you're ready now. Oh, I don't think we're hearing you. Well, so to give her maybe a little bit more time, one of the interesting things as we were engaging, oh, there you are. Go ahead, Joy.
Yeah, sorry, it takes a while for my camera to activate. Yeah, I think just to pick up on some of the things going through the chat, I think we can't expect repositories to be the ones who are implementing all of these things at the point of ingest. So much of this has to be really kind of thought through at the very start of the project. So I think, you know, there's been chat through the chat box, all of the people who have the data management planning tools. I think we need to start thinking about how we start to embed the questions. So I think there's an action for me to try and see, you know, in DMP Online, how the templates might be, you know, tweaked in a minor way to start getting people to just through the questions. But I did wonder if, you know, I don't know whether any of the other DMP related working groups or interest groups are thinking about these things, or whether we should be trying to get them to think about some of these things, particularly things around the machine actionable groups, and, you know, just trying to think about how we join things up. So, but all really great talks. So thank you very much for all of this.
Yeah. So,
okay. So, and I think one other aspect, which is which I hear from, is that things like Indigenous data governance, it sounds easy, but actually to do it in practice is quite complicated, and it requires some expertise and experience and skills, etc. So a lot of that is often not in place either. I don't know if there's anybody here that's working in the skills space, but I think that's also one of the things that would flow forward from the CARE principles, is thinking about how to upskill researchers or support staff within universities or other research organizations to be able to support these concepts.
Rob, maybe I can come here in. This is why I said that I think that the CARE principle has to go as a horizontal knowledge more to the RDA community as a whole. Yeah, with some working groups, like with the fair data maturity model, it's a concrete work together. With some of them, it's only a session to share ideas and to be aware. Yeah, simply you cannot care about things which you do not know about them. Yeah, so there are different levels, and I very much welcome that the CARE and FAIR in hand going to the other working groups to explain the process.
One of the interesting things that came out as we were working with the CARE team is that because of all of the different nuances and what a community might need for their data, Maui didn't give a lot of description or examples, but maybe I'll give him a second to think of them as I'm talking. But you know, some data is only meant for women to see. Data having to do with animal movement is only available for others to look at when it's not hunting season. So you have to consider different elements, different metadata that have to be managed, and access requirements. So our takeaway from that was, wow, if you implemented, if you support the FAIR principles for data, you know, robust metadata, then you're better positioned as a repository to enable what's needed for care, because it's at a more detailed level, more different ways of looking at governance. So I saw one comment like folks are not quite sure how these things go together, but yet implementation is rather robust. So it should be interesting to consider together.
Yeah, so if I add, I was just thinking about the data management DMP online, and some of the conversations that people have been thinking about in terms of machine actionable data management plans as well. So one of the elements of metadata, so one of the, I would say, barriers to Indigenous governance is actually being able to recognize data as Indigenous in the first place. And so unless you can have a way of sort of identifying it, and that might come about in different ways. In some places, it's because you have ethnicity data that's associated with the material, which allows you to kind of identify it as being relevant or related to a particular group, which then gives them the opportunity to be a part of it. One of the projects that I'm working on around traditional knowledge and biocultural labels then uses a sort of a digital tagging process as a way of doing the same thing, being able to tag the data sets. And so that allows you to, I guess, enter the realm of governance. And then what you can do then within that space, at least through the way that the labels have been put together, some of them reflect traditional protocols, which might be around the ways in which they would normally share the knowledge, and that knowledge might be shared at particular times, as Shelley mentioned, seasonal aspects. It might be related to gender restrictions, and so those things can be reflected through the labels, and then the label becomes the mechanism which you can start to develop some kind of machine actionable data management processes. And similarly, this sort of idea of being able to reflect provenance, reflect these protocols, and then think about what kinds of permissions communities are putting in place, in a very similar manner to how Creative Commons has different sorts of licenses for different activities. These sorts of different permissions which Indigenous communities are indicating through the use of the labels also allows you to think about what does that mean in terms of how information can be pulled together and aggregated in different ways. So I think those tools and other ones will emerge over time. But I think this whole idea about what sort of metadata is useful for enabling these sorts of processes or care to be reflected into the future, really useful ones for us to be happening at the moment. So what's next? We're either having more discussions, questions to throw to the group. Feel free to unmute yourself and share your video if you want to join the fun. And
hey, I'll unmute myself, and I'm not going to have my thoughts totally collected here, so I'll try my best. But I'm so interested in this topic. Sorry, Natalie Harrower, Digital Repository of Ireland. And I'd like to offer my, I'd like to get involved in some way. So I don't know what the best way is. I'm really interested in what we can do at the repository level, because that's what we offer at DRI. I have lots of thoughts around this. I mean, we're also in the process at DRI. We have a quality, diversity, inclusivity working group that we started at the beginning of the year, and we're trying to look through all aspects of what we do from this lens, to work on a policy, but also to think about, what communities we connect with and how and all of the rest. So I'm kind of keeping these things, the fair and care and that larger effort that we're doing institutionally in mind. So I don't know if it's best to maybe get involved, Shelley, in the group you posted that Margaret is running, or where is best to go. And from an Irish perspective, care principles, how they'd be applied would be quite different than what's being discussed from, say, where I'm from, which is Canada. But you know, there is a community of travelers in Ireland that's considered an ethnicity, a specific ethnicity. We don't have a lot of connection with that community with DRI. It's something I'd like to build. So yeah, there's a few things going through my head, but I find this very exciting. So tell me where I can best get involved. I like the idea of the mapping and the work to connect FAIR and CARE at a repository level, I think is very, very good. So, okay, I'll stop talking.
Yeah, Shelley, hook her up, Shelley.
So I did put Margaret's email into the notes, and I know that Margaret is open to more support on this. For our particular deliverable with that cluster, we're probably close to the level of detail that, but it would be great to hand our thinking over to maybe an RDA working group. So back to this operationalizing concept. So one of the challenges is we have a framework for CARE, and Edith laid out the process that FAIR took, right? It's a long time. And we have an opportunity to use what we've learned, rev engines, and move faster for CARE because we have a path that's perhaps useful and you know, there's Maui, I don't think there's an assessment yet.
No.
So if I remember, that's one of the considerations that's coming up soon for the team to look at.
I think we'll be spending a little bit of time trying to sort of refine and get to the point where we've got sort of a sensible set of indicators before that kind of assessment component. We know we do have the material that have been put together for FAIR and how that assessment was done, so that sort of the framework for it is in place. But I think there will be this sort of element of thinking it across. Thinking about whether all the indicators are the same in each part of, or each across the sort of the life cycle, and it may be that there's a sort of ones that relate for the kind of researcher project, you know, generation of data space, another one that's kind of thinking, or ones that are more suited for a repository space, and then other ones that are, you know, a bit more highlighted towards a kind of secondary use, access. It's a number of, I think one of the challenging things about having it so focused on the people element is it's dependent on the way people use it after the fact. So you can access the data, you can kind of do your analysis, and then it gets handed on. So it's sort of almost like a couple of steps removed from the decision, kind of the actual decision that you're making to allow it to go in particular places. And often I think that's going to be a little bit challenging for us to work through, but I think that goes back to Edith's point about, you know, some things are policy related and other things will have a more technical component to it.
Okay, thanks. I'll email Margaret as a start.
Having said this, I think that the policies are very important because the policies are very often driven by the founders who define what should be the projects about. Yeah, so I think that it's very important that the policy elements are going directly to the policymakers and to the funders because they can inbuild it to the requirement. Yeah, and if I see in Europe that how much the EOS process was policy driven after all, then the policies matters, not only the technical solutions.
Excellent. So does anyone here know how to operate the breakout rooms?
Yes. So what's really important here is that you have to, you'll have someone that goes into the breakout rooms with you, and we have to watch time and coming back ourselves. So you're on your honor to and Maui, is it 20 minutes we want to be in the breakout room?
Sure.
Okay. All right. So that is Can somebody do the math? How many minutes past the top of the hour will that be?
Well, if we just give it a couple more minutes, because I see a couple of questions that are on here. But if we were to go from 5:02 to quarter past the hour.
Okay, quarter past. So the breakout rooms are at the you have to, underneath the videos, you have to scroll down and everything moves up. It's very cool. And you can see there's 4 buttons down there, breakout A, B, C, and D. And before we go ahead, Maui.
Oh, yeah, before we go, I just saw that there was a question here from Rob about have connections been made already between care principles and access and benefit sharing? Oh, is that a question for me? Okay. So I guess my sort of answer in that instance is not directly, but by default. So certainly in the context of some of the work we've been doing around the traditional or the biocultural labels and how they might sort of reflect some of the ideas within the care principles, they're being developed in a way that can link directly towards access and benefit sharing. So labels that are developed that speak to consent being verified and sorts of agreements to being open to collaborate or open to commercialize, kind of set a foundation for them, even if it doesn't quite meet all of the conditions of, say, mutually agreed terms. But I think that's a really, really kind of interesting thing to start working towards. So I think the intention with the breakout rooms is that breakout room A will be, if you're interested in talking about the principles or sub-principles related to collective benefit. Breakout room B will be for authority to control. Breakout room C is related to responsibility, and breakout room D is related to ethics. So feel free to join whichever breakout room you like. We'll all be working off the same Google Doc, just putting our ideas in the relevant section, and we'll look to come back into this main area at 1:15 p.m.